Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome Lloyd Lalonde, who is a research associate in biomedical data science at the Heart and Lung Institute at the university here. And he is the founder of the Green Algorithms Project, which is an initiative promoting environmentally sustainable computational science. And his interests are wide-ranging, including radiogenetics, combining medical imaging and genetic information with ML to better understand and treat cardiovascular disease. So delighted to welcome you, Lloyd, and please do take it away with your talk on the hidden costs of computing and green principles. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So happy to be here. Hopefully the tech will work fine, but if not, we can adapt. Well, before starting, I guess in terms of background, as you said, my background is more in statistics and machine learning, so feeling very at home here. But for my PhD, I kind of jumped across and ended up in the clinical school. And working in computational biology. So importantly, I'm not here at all to say we shouldn't do computational science anymore or we shouldn't do AI. I would also be out of a job. So but mostly to highlight potential drawbacks of it. Starting quite broad before jumping into like pure computer science. So when thinking about carbon footprint of research, there are quite a few papers trying to estimate the carbon footprint of scientists, and we got estimates that go from like 5 to 40 tons of CO2 per year, which if we compare to the IPCC target, which is 2 tons per person and per year, is quite a lot more. I quite like that. So ENBOL is the European Biology Laboratory, and so it's a multi-site institution. They've got EBI, the bioinformatic arm of that, which is based at Kingston on the Wellcome Genome campus, just not far of Cambridge. And they publish annual statistics. And they find that for each publication coming out of the institute, it's around 65 tons of CO2. So it's a bit of that includes everything because that's the total carbon footprint divided by the number of papers, but still that's a scarily high estimate. And it's around 29 tons per full-time staff. So we're very much in the same kind of numbers we were talking about before. They do a lot of wet labs, so we could argue that computing is lower than that. If we look at the ICT, so information and communication technology, lots of estimates. They usually range between 2 and 3%, saying so the carbon footprint of the ICT sector between 2 and 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. There was this review from a few years ago. Each line is a forecast of what the ICT sector will go to. They can't agree on anything, but they can agree it's going up, basically, in terms of carbon footprint, which is the problem is it shouldn't. All sectors need to reduce by something like 90% over the next 30 years. Some of the orders of magnitude, just to better understand what share of a country it represents. So France has done amazing work, really, by putting a lot of resources studying this topic. So they find that, for example, the digital sector, so it's a bit broader than the ICT sector. It also includes things like streaming. Is about 2.5% of national greenhouse gas emission and about 10% of national electricity usage. Globally, the share is a little bit lower. Part of the reason being that French electricity is particularly green. And so if we keep zooming in and we focus on data centers, it's almost impossible to know exactly the greenhouse gas emission from data centers globally, but estimates tend to agree on this. The latest one on these 126 megatons, so around 120 megaton of CO2 equivalent per year, which is basically the same as the American commercial aviation in the same time. So not completely negligible in quantity. I promise it's kind of the end of all these numbers, but it's just to try to put in context and understand what share it represents. In the UK, we're talking about 4% of electricity consumption for UK data centers. It's around 1% globally. Okay, so that's for the general sector. Science is quite niche in that. And I quite like these statistics from XSEED. So XSEED is now concluded, but until recently, it was a network of institutions in the US. So a bunch of universities put their data center together to make it more efficient. And when Florida goes to sleep, then California can use the resources. And what's interesting is they publish statistics. And so in 2020, there was 9 billion compute hours being used on that. That's about 24 million compute hours every day, which I still find very high. Even even knowing the scale of task, it's quite an extraordinary number, considering it's all in all, it's quite a small part of world's research. It's just some universities in one country. And what's interesting as well is the pie chart, where we can see that it's quite well spread out across all fields of science. So it's not just it's not just astrophysics being responsible for everything, or just biology. There's a bit of everything, and I would assume things like AI probably get kind of scattered around a bit of everything. Now, if we really zoom in and we're like, okay, well, one analysis, one project, what's the carbon footprint? So these are obtained from computational biology. It doesn't really matter if you're not very familiar with them. The one on the top left, GWAS, is a genome-wide association study. So anytime you read a paper that says we found the gene for X, that's what they did usually. And we're talking running it for 1,000 different traits, which is not that uncommon. We can reach almost 20 tons of CO2, which is quite a lot for just one analysis and one project. But there are also some other analysis, unsurprisingly, require fewer computing resources and therefore much smaller carbon footprints. And the idea of this overview is just to show that the point is not to be completely paranoid about doing anything on computers and thinking of, it's destroying the environment every time we do. But the fact that some analysis, and I'm going to get to AI in a minute, some analysis have these weirdly high carbon footprint means that we need to be mindful of these in particular, and at least know which ones are the big ones and which ones aren't. There was this attempt at quantifying. So this one was before really so it was 2022, but I think the preprint was 2021. So it was before we had the latest wave of LLMs. But they show that carbon footprint of models can reach the equivalent of a home, and I'm sure it doesn't surprise many people here. This one's quite interesting. It compares different large language models, and I'm sure you're familiar with GPT-3 coming before ChatGPT, and they find just training it once, we're talking 550 tons of CO2 just for this one training. So slightly concerning, and then there was 3.1 and 0.2, and then all the different ones they released and didn't release, and all the research. So the real carbon footprint is much larger. And that takes us to the problem we have, which is especially being at a well-funded university like Cambridge. We talk from the start. I talked about all these environmental costs of computing, but really in terms of financial costs of computing, we don't really have much. As researchers, we're quite lucky that we don't have to pay a lot of money. Sorry about that. We don't have to pay a lot of money to do compute, and that's great. That enables research and scientists who then have to use. I don't know if any of you end up using cloud computing, but that's usually a bit of a shock to the system when suddenly you have to pay a lot more money for core hours. So that's a great thing, except it looks like it doesn't cost anything, and so it can be quite tempting to waste it, because this argument that I'm sure you've already heard, oh, well, may as well run it because no one's using the server at that time, so it doesn't cost us anything. But except it's using more electricity, and so there's a carbon footprint associated with it. Very brief background before jumping into the details. Maybe you're all very familiar with that, and if so, I'm sorry. But if we think about the environmental impact of research, there are these four main aspects that we can think about, and that's like travels, either being field work or probably here more conferences, wet lab research or experimental work, like in the new physics department across the road, computing, and we're going to focus on that, and then just having offices open. And I always start with these fun facts, or I don't know if they're fun, but about conference travel. So climate change scientists tend to fly more than other researchers, which is slightly unfortunate. And unsurprisingly, carbon footprint correlates very highly with seniority in the field. Conferences are a massive issue, and I'm going to touch on a few of the AI conferences a bit later, but there are these estimates because conferences are easy to estimate because you know where everyone's flying from, you know where everyone's flying to, easy enough. The American Geophysical Union, they're talking 80,000 tons of CO2 per week. That's about the same carbon footprint of Edinburgh for the same time, which has slightly more people than this conference. or the neuroscience conference at the bottom. And there was this interesting example coming from astronomy, where they showed that they did exactly the same meeting 2 years in a row, but then COVID happened. So the first year was fully in person, the second year was fully virtual. Unsurprisingly, they find that the virtual meeting is like 3,000 times less carbon emissions. Now, it's not at all to say we should do everything absolutely virtual, because there are great benefits to having meetings in person. But hopefully we can keep some kind of hybrid, which has been a bit disappointing to see more and more meetings going back fully in person and banning all of the hybrid options, which doesn't really make sense, especially when you take into account all the benefits in terms of accessibility that having hybrid meetings. Okay, so after this kind of long introduction, let's focus on computing itself. I'm not going to talk about things like, streaming Netflix or using Zoom like we are here, just really focus on kind of high performance computing, or, either things running for a long time or using a lot of resources. And you may have come across some of these headlines from 2019, 2020, and that's very much one of the first papers really looking at the carbon footprint of computing itself, of like research computing. And that was started by, unsurprisingly, natural language processing. And I think at the time, BERT was the big one. And that was their issue. They were like, well, it's starting to take an awful lot of time to train it. So why, what's the corresponding carbon footprint? And that made got quite a lot of traction. And there was then followed by some really interesting papers. There's been a lot more since then, but these are kind of the seminal work. You're probably all familiar with the stochastic parrot one at the bottom right, which talked about other aspects, but including environmental impact, and has the title of bringing down the entire Google ethics team as a result of that. They all got fired for writing the paper. I really like that the last author is Margaret Mitchell, because Margaret Mitchell was still at Google at the time. That didn't protect her, sadly. AI and climate change, and we go kind of all the way back to the start of the talk, which is it's complicated. There's no doubt that AI can definitely help. And, we were talking about some examples in ecology just before, or reforestation and digital twin and so on. So yeah, no doubt, lots of ways AI and computing in general can help to fight climate change and will be part of the solution. But we also have to be mindful of the fact that it is also part of the problem. Is how do we strike this limit? Well, part of it is just being transparent about the benefit and the cost, and not ignoring the cost altogether. And now there are more and more work, and it's been really good to see more fields starting to be mindful of the carbon footprint of computing in their particular field. So, things like neuroscience here, astrophysics, particle physics, social science, and, all these that then I'll have some examples from neuroscience later, but we can really come up with interesting solutions to tackle specific issues. And finally, for what I'm going to talk about in the next few slides, all kinds of computing. I mean, at the end of the day, computers are computers, so all the principles apply. It doesn't really matter if we're talking like gaming computer or more like structured HPC. Something that makes it hard when we think about environmental impacts of computing is there are many ways to slice that pie. The first one is, for example, to think about use stage. So, the using mostly electricity usage due to using the computer versus embodied impact, which is manufacturing, extraction of raw material, manufacturing, distribution, and then end of life. And we tend to only focus on use stage, but really, in the case of consumer devices, like your phone, your laptop, your tablet, the vast majority comes from manufacturing, actually. So in a smartphone, 98% of the footprint is manufacturing. So, with phones, it doesn't really matter how we use them. What matters is to keep them for as long as possible, because we save these 98% from happening again. The manufacturing share for servers in data center is lower, not because they're cleaner to manufacture, just because they used a lot more, so the pie is bigger. And if we jump to the other side of the spectrum, and so we look at end of life, that's the kind of depressing slide of the day. It's a report by the World Health Organization, assessing that over 80% of the 50 million tons of electronic waste are handled by up to 50 million of what they call informal waste workers, which is people who are working in dump sites. including up to 18 million children in the waste processing industry. And the main problem is electronic waste are not predicted to diminish anytime soon. And if you're interested in more of the research side of understanding end-of-life environmental impact, this review that is just out is really interesting. But the main bottom line of that is people like manufacturers don't do it, and they don't really know how to do it, and no one can agree on methods. So that's manufacturing costs are already not very well studied, but end of life is even worse. Another way to think about it is to compare carbon footprint. So just thinking about greenhouse gas emission versus a broader environmental impact, and we were talking a little bit about that before. And that's the problem. We tend to only think about greenhouse gas emission, including in this talk. That's mostly what I'm talking about. But there are all the other environmental impacts. So for example, this metric. I have no idea how much water an average size hospital uses. But I'm pretty much sure I don't want a data center to be the same as 3 hospitals. And whether the metric is exactly accurate or not, but just the magnitude is an issue in itself. Okay, this is a very messy plot, but just to point at 2 things. On the right-hand side, we've got these planetary boundaries, which you may be familiar with already. They're basically setting up boundaries to say, how can we leave the planet not worse off at the end of the year than it was at the start? And we're obviously burning through most of them all the time. So they're quite easy to comprehend concepts, like land use or climate change. And climate change is greenhouse gas emissions in this context, and acidification and so on. And on the left-hand side, these are all the categories that are generally used for life cycle assessments of different products or activities. And they don't particularly match. So they're slightly different metrics and slightly different categories, but they give an idea of everything we need to consider. And the only one directly related to greenhouse gas emission is climate change in that. So everything else is different aspects of the problem. And the paper I took the figure from, they actually map the 2 together. So how can we put life cycle assessment category in context with planetary boundaries, which is really interesting in terms of public communication, because something like photochemical ozone formation is not directly clear, but the concept of planetary boundary is quite clear to people. And so that's an interesting one. But that shows that we need to think about things much more broadly than just greenhouse gas emission. And finally, computing versus storage. I'm sure it all depends on projects. You probably have projects where it's all compute, and actually the data, or you have a few gigabytes, maybe terabytes, but it's not that big. And you probably have projects where it's all about data storage and very, very few compute. Particularly working in bioinformatics, we have some cases where the compute is not the big limiting factor, but storage really is. And we're in a world now where individual projects reach easily petabytes of data. So it's starting to be a bit of an issue. And if we look at the energy bill of an average data center, usually only half the power provided to the facility actually goes to the servers. And 10% is for storage, and the remaining is for mostly cooling, so all the overheads. So there are lots of numbers, but if you want to remember an order of magnitude of the carbon footprint of storing data, it's around 10 kilograms of CO2. So again, to store 1 terabyte of data for a year. And that's very much an order of magnitude more than an exact value. But if we look at computing now, to understand the carbon footprint of computing, it's reasonably simple on paper. We need to figure out how much energy we need, and that only depends on hardware and software. What are we doing and what hardware we're using for it? And then we figure out the carbon footprint of producing that much electricity, which is mostly due to the mostly linked to the place where you are, because most data centers are plugged into the main power grid. Now, there are 2 ways for the energy usage. You can obviously measure it. You can put watt meters and so on and track what's happening. But as a user, and that's what started our project, when we started working on that, was very much to think about our carbon footprint as scientists for the projects we're doing. And in our case, we're using CSD3 as a data center. We have no idea what the energy usage of CSD3, and we can't really go there and put a watt meter for our little analysis. So instead, and we know the first ones to do it was, okay, how can we estimate that from basic parameter parameters about the job that we can actually know. And the idea is to say, well, actually, we can estimate it from runtime. And then just focusing on two main components, so processing cores, either CPU or GPU, and memory, and figuring out the power draw from that. And then multiplying that by the PUE, so the power usage effectiveness, which is the metric that quantifies overheads. So it's the ratio between all the electricity provided to the facility divided by the electricity that actually goes into servers. And that tells us how efficient the data center is. So if we expand this formula a little bit, because that might be of interest, we can go a little bit deeper. So we can start to think about, for the processing cores, okay, that's the default power usage of a processing core, but then we can scale that by how much is being used. You know, is your CPU used 50% and so on. And that involves a lot of assumptions that are not perfectly accurate, but I'll show some benchmarks later. And then for memory, well, memory has this crafty characteristic that mostly power usage depends on the memory available, not so much on the memory we use, which is not great in terms of energy efficiency, but it makes it a little bit easier to estimate it. And the last bit, the carbon intensity, so the carbon footprint of actually producing electricity, and that's where we were touching about that before, that's where we have great disparities between countries. So electricity map is quite interesting. It shows a range of values. For example, if we were to move compute between Sweden to Poland, same hardware, same software, same task, multiplying carbon footprint by 46 on average, just because the electricity is much higher carbon in Poland than in Sweden. But okay, that's a bit far-fetched as an example, because we're talking about cross-country. So let's look at the US. So we're on the northwest coast of the US in Washington State, and let's say, just moving from one county to the next, still multiplying carbon footprint by 9, again, just due to different sources of electricity consumption. And that's an issue, but that's also an opportunity, because we're lucky enough that we don't actually have to be next to our data center. And if you're interested, particularly for the UK, there's more precise metrics on this website that's done between Oxford and the National Grid, so that can be quite interesting. Okay, I always have that at that point in the talk, because it's all been a bit negative so far. But again, I'm not saying at all we shouldn't do science. And there are actually a lot of cases, and I'm sure you can think about a lot of them. Oh, sorry, I lost something. Oh, here we are. There are lots of cases where actually better scientific practices go hand in hand with more sustainability. It's not necessarily a trade-off, or do we want to be green, or do we all want to do good science? And with that in mind, we try to come together to set up some basic principles for the field. Something a little bit similar to the FAIR principles for open data. So we brought together funders, people like the Wellcome Trust or UKI, but also research institute like EBI or the Health Data Research UK and universities in Cambridge, and we came up with these greener principles. And I'm going to use that as a template for the rest of our time. So the first two are governance and responsibility, and that's a way to say, who can have an impact and who can make a difference. And the answer is going to be quite boring, but it's going to be everyone. But in particularly when it comes to sustainability, grassroots movements are really important and have really good benefits and really push for differences. I'm sure you probably have some here in the departments. There's been lots of green research initiatives around the world. The Netherlands particularly big on it, and we really need that. The challenge with grassroots movement is if we want to change anything on a large scale, we also need top-down buy-in, and that's where we need to be. And once we have all these together, so PIs and training teams, but also more largely funding bodies, governments, and journals. And we need to include industry, especially when in computing, we can't just stay in academia, partly because a large part of academic research is done either in partnership with industry or maybe using cloud computing, but also a large part of the compute that happens on a daily basis is done by and for industry. So we have to engage with them as well. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just a few examples of what can be done. Research institutions have a big role to play. They can promote efficiency, things like trusted research environment, rather than everyone having a separate copy of the data. And it comes with challenges and so on, but there are opportunities here. EBI, the European Bioinformatics Institute, is a really good example. They make all the data open access. They're becoming a really good resource for it. And for example, for AlphaFold, the protein folding model that was developed by DeepMind, they partnered with EBI to create AlphaFold DB, which is an open access database of all the predicted structures, which means that instead of having scientists around the world rerunning the models and remaking predictions for themselves, they can just go on there. They had over 700 million API requests in the first year of operations. And so that's a really good example of that. One of the things in terms of research institutions, one of the things wet lab or particularly biology, but experimental labs have, and we don't really in computing, is certification framework. So you're probably familiar with Athena Swan for EDI, where you can get bronze, silver, or gold. Something called LEAF, which is the same thing for wet labs, and it's been incredibly popular as a tool for research groups and institutions to be more sustainable. And we kept being prompted to do it. So this is actually coming out. The grand announcement hasn't happened yet, but it's coming out in the coming couple of weeks. So we created this. We called it Green Disc for Digital Sustainability Certification, and that's basically the same thing. So it's something that can be done at institutional level and group level. So it needs to happen at these two levels, and it's easy steps groups and people can take to. To be more sustainable. So yeah, if that's of interest, I'll be sharing my slides afterwards. Anyway, funders. Obviously, funders can make a massive difference in terms of in terms of sustainability, because researchers would do anything to get funding. And one of the big things we were saying is, okay, well, they're already telling us don't kill the environment, but it's not it's not very strict. But a couple of things that came out recently, UKI, they came up with the name is not great, but they came up with a net zero digital research infrastructure scoping project. And the report came out last August, setting out the grand, a roadmap for UKI to have what, net zero DRI by 2030. Of 2035, which is quite an ambitious project. Wellcome also looked at the carbon footprint of their research. And actually just came out a few weeks ago, this concordat for the environmental sustainability of research and innovation, signed by all the major actors. So UKI signed it, the Wellcome Trust. It was all endorsed by the main academies of science. A range of universities signed it, sadly not Cambridge yet, but that's going to grow, hopefully. And that's a really interesting effort where they all come together and they said, well, we have to be aware of the environmental impact of the research we fund. We can't just bury our head in the sand. And that's a really positive step in this direction. One of the things we've been arguing for a long time is environmental impact statements, is to say, okay, well, it should be reasonable to expect people when applying for funds to justify why the research they plan on doing is not going to completely destroy the environment. And why it's worth it. The same way we do with clinical research, we have ethical statements, or with funding, we say, well, why is it worth that much money? And then usually the answer was, well, it's complicated, red tape, and so on. But actually, the French government decided to just do it for AI. So apologies for the slides in French, but it's just screenshots from there. But basically what they did is they had, so it was a partnership between the French Department for the Environment and the what they call France 2030, which is the national targeted new technology funding call, where they fund all kind of exciting stuff. And so they had a 40 million euros funding call for how AI can help local communities to be more sustainable, optimize energy grid in your village, in your town or something like that. And they said, well, that's fine, but every single application has to estimate the carbon footprint of the AI solution they propose, of training it and then deploying it. And they have to include that in their application. And it was nice that they got in touch with us, because they said, they all had to use our calculator to do that. And it worked really well. The bottom line was people were fine with it. Scientists understood why it was asked of them. They gave very clear guidelines, so it wasn't a lot of burden on scientists to do it. And there was 40 million euros on the table, so it turns out people could spare a few hours to think about that. And because it worked so well and they thought it was a sensible thing to have, they now decided to include the same guidelines, so using the green algorithm calculator, to all the AI funding calls coming out of this France 2030. Particularly, they've got this 1.5 billion euros generative AI call. Some would argue that maybe in terms of sustainability, that's not the best use of 1.5 billion euros, but that's a separate question. At least they have to be transparent about their impacts. Industry, as I said, well, we need to engage, but also absolutely brilliant initiatives, and a lot of the data center efficiency came out of industry, came out of cloud providers, because it's both good to do, but also it saves money. We were talking earlier about Lumi data center in Finland. I think it's in Finland, and yeah, and so that's really good. In the field of AI in particular, there is more convincing to do, and not everyone buys it in that. So there's a node at Google Brain who basically decided to dedicate their work to say that AI doesn't really have a footprint and it's going to save the environment. So if we could all stop doing what we're doing, that would be great. They're not very happy with the kind of work I'm doing. They actually, in one of their preprints, they actually attacked our tools and tried to test it to show, and I'm gonna use that in a minute. It didn't quite work. They didn't show what they wanted to show. But it's a bit disappointing that these people who are clear leaders in the field use their platform instead of just saying we think it's worth doing, which is a fair enough argument. The argument is a bit different. It's that, well, we shouldn't think about environmental impact. Being French, and when you learn machine learning in France, Yann LeCun is basically God on earth. And he jumped on the bandwagon, now being the head of AI at Facebook, saying, "Oh, total bullshit, all these." I'm just quoting for accuracy. And the tweet at the bottom was originally in French, and he basically completely unleashed at this Eco-Info group, which is part of the CNRS, which is the national body of research. It's a very serious group of researchers, quite senior researchers working on sustainable IT, and he basically called them medieval obscurantists. And it doesn't translate very well, but that's not a very nice thing. But basically,
Luddites.
Yeah, Luddites, exactly. And that's the issue here, is that although there's amazing work being done at both Facebook and Google, people working on AI sustainability, that just doesn't set the right tone, and it makes it quite hard for researchers to take it seriously. Okay, in practice, so that was all the theory and so on, but how can we estimate the carbon footprint of what we're doing on computers in practice? So if you're interested, I'm not going to, just because of time, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but you can check out this paper, which is a very short text, but that kind of summarizes step by step. And if you want something more in depth, but targeted at deep learning, this work by Lucia Buzia-Egert, who is quite interesting, but much more details. And the bottom line, and probably the tools you may have seen already, are things like Code Carbon or Carbon Tracker, who are basically Python packages. So it's just a Python package, you put in your code, and it tracks what you're doing as you're doing it. And then it produces a report. The bottom line of these tools is they're great when they work. But it's not at all a diss on the tools, it's just technical restrictions. So for example, you need quite a lot of admin rights on the machine to be able to, because of the way they're querying power from the CPUs. And so in many cases, it doesn't actually feed back the information. But when they work, completely painless, brilliant tools to have. Our problem when we started working on this topic was to say, okay, that's all great. We are in the bioinformatics labs. 80% of the department is using R. They're not using Python, and they're not doing machine learning. And because of where the field came from, and I was talking about at the start, all these packages were developed by people for AI in machine learning, AI and machine learning in Python. And so there was this enormous black hole where a large part of research is not Python and is not machine learning, a large part of the computing happening. And that's what prompted us, where it was really just over 4 years ago now, to do these green algorithms, but to do it at an online calculator. Was to say, well, it doesn't matter what field of science you're in, it doesn't matter what kind of hardware you have, it doesn't matter what programming language, what matters is how much resources you're using. And anyone can just go on there and can put how long the model runs for, hardware, software, just hardware actually, where they are in the world, and it gives reasonable estimates of carbon footprint. And that also means you can estimate it before you start a project, and we go back to the example of the French funding calls, you can actually estimate it and include it in a cost-benefit analysis even before starting. So it's all open source, all the data is on GitHub.
Who's maintaining it?
Me. The problem of an online calculator is it's not very practical if you have 100 different jobs with slightly different parameters and slightly different runtimes. And I said, well, I don't know if you work with CSD3 or if you work on, but here CSD3 is based on Slurm, and you've got all the logs. So it's, although it doesn't charge us a lot of money, it still tracks everything we're doing. And I thought, okay, well, maybe I can just pull these logs and estimate carbon footprint based on that in a slightly more automated way. And so so basically I did that. And so if we zoom in on that, it's less pretty because it's in the terminal, but it's a very simple piece of code. It pulls all the logs from Slurm for yourself, and then it's using the same formula as the online calculator, and it gives like things like the impact of failed jobs, which is a slightly heartbreaking, but also memory over allocation and metrics like that. And again, completely open access. If that's something that's of interest, do let me know, because if you use CSD3, I've got all the parameters files. But it's reasonably, it doesn't require any admin rights to install, which was the key element. And now we're taking it to the next step. We say, okay, well, we got the back end. How can we make it a pretty front end? And at EDI, they did that. They basically took our backend method and they put a really good dashboard on top of that. And so that's what we're working on now, is to say, okay, how can we combine the two together, make it an open access and open source solution for institutions that don't really have the manpower in-house to build their own dashboards. And so that should come soon. Briefly, because next is more bioinformatics, but that's just getting embedded into like pipeline. So it's a pipeline manager, and basically now it's embedding carbon footprint estimation. Okay, the bottom line is, does it work? And that's the figure from the Google paper. So basically what they did is they tested our tool, and we're trying to say that, look, these are crazy people, you shouldn't listen to their estimates of carbon footprint. So we want, the bars are the ratio between estimations and real values. So the closer to 1, the better. And the green ones are our tool, and we can ignore the red ones. Let's look at the good ones for now. First time I was amazed, like when I did the online calculator, I was not pretending it to be a perfectly accurate value. It was just supposed to be a reasonable ballpark estimates. On these deep learning benchmarks, we are within, less, like sometimes 5–10% of the real value measured by Google in their data center, which I was quite amazed by. And that's, perfectly happy with that. Obviously, the point of Google was to say, look at these tool values here. The first thing being like, if you told me, well, you overestimate by a factor 2, I would have still been happy for an online calculator. And if we look at what happened here, basically, we don't do very well on Google TPU. So, as you probably know, they are the Google's very own AI chips. Because they don't sell them, they don't tell anyone what their expected power usage is, because they don't have to, because they don't sell them. So the bottom line is to say, when it's using hardware where the data is publicly available, the tool works very well. When they don't release data, the tool doesn't work very well. I'm happy with that. And they probably didn't realize it didn't show what it needed to, because then the figure got removed from a later version of the preprint. And actually now they've released power usage metrics for the TPUs, so that's better. Slightly more academic benchmark. So if we look at the one I point at here, that's the GAs for green algorithm. And the bottom line, the bottom row is for GPU benchmarks. And again, incredibly accurate on GPU benchmark, because GPUs are quite reliable. If you're training a neural network, it's going to be 100% usage reality. Obviously, I need to point at the top row as well, where we calculators massively underestimate power usage, again, by a factor 3. That's not great. CPUs are hard, and that's one of the things we're working on now, is to say, okay, how can we do better on CPUs? But that's hard. Very briefly, the importance of transparency. So one of the things we started doing in our lab is to acknowledge the carbon footprint of a paper. So say, well, the analysis that we conducted for this paper, these are the corresponding carbon footprint. And it's been really good to see more and more people doing things like that. You may have noticed, if any of you submitted papers to NeurIPS in 2021, that there was, as part of their paper checklist, they were encouraging authors to acknowledge the carbon footprint of their tools, which I thought was great, and didn't cost anything, and that was absolutely brilliant. But apparently that was a bit too much work, because they removed that in 2023, which again I'm a bit puzzled by, because I'm like, well, why? But maybe there's a good reason behind it. Then reducing, well, kind of touch about that, so I don't want to spend too much time on that. But you know, a couple of years ago we published these 10 simple rules, but they're very high level. So it's things I talked about, and you know, you were talking in the meeting before about code efficiency, and that's a big part of it. Is okay, sometimes it's worth of optimizing the code, even if we can afford to wait just for environmental reason. But just this cost benefit analysis is quite interesting, because that's really what we're talking about here, is how to balance the potential benefits of research with the environmental costs. And I quite like the way the Royal Society put it, which is to say digital technology developed and deployed the same pursuit of net zero. I would actually just remove that. I would just say digital technology must be energy proportionate. And that's just having a reasonable expectation that the benefits will outweigh the cost of developing the technology. And I think that's fair enough. It's obviously very hard to quantify the benefits, but we do it for grants and for money already. You know, we say, sure, it's really hard to know what the benefit of this research is, but we think it's worth £1 million. So we should be able to do the same thing of saying, why is it worth 500 tons of CO2? This cost benefit gets even trickier when we think about the fact that obviously the people benefiting from the latest Amazon Alexa technology or latest MRI smart device are not the same population who will suffer the most from climate change. So it's a very, rather complicated notion of cost benefit. I don't have any solution to that, just highlighting it. What can we talk about next? Very briefly, some avenues that have been explored for sustainability, and you'll notice that they are no different to good coding practices, I'm sure. Neuroscience, they really looked at the carbon footprint of neuroscience pipeline, so work from the University of Sussex. It's really interesting. The pie chart I quite love. The pie is the total data being generated from a brain MRI pre-processing pipeline. The green slice are the data ever being used by anyone. But obviously everything gets stored because you don't really know. So the fact that they, you know, it's very simple, but the fact that they actually looked at that, now they can say, well, now we know, now we can just delete all of that, and that can become part of the default setting for the software or whatever. But it wasn't. And they also found that sometimes, you know, the default flags were completely inefficient and running a lot of analysis that most researchers didn't need down the line. We talk about the difference in carbon intensity of electricity between countries. The screens there are very red, so they make it even more scary than the original map. But that obviously opens up opportunities. You can relocate compute. Let's say you're a scientist in Poland. Maybe it's worth putting your compute in a low carbon location. Great opportunities. We need to be particularly mindful when we start talking about low and middle income countries, because we don't want to go to a low middle income country and say, don't worry, give us your compute, give us your data, but you know, we've got low carbon, so we got you covered. So we need to be really mindful of dynamics there, but there is this opportunity if done well. And there's also a temporal opportunity. So, you know, these are just 2 screenshots from whenever I did them, but the date doesn't really matter. It's just the carbon footprint of electricity changes a lot over a 24-hour period, because it's some parts of the day you've got more renewable and some parts of the day we've got less of it. Which was actually, we don't always need our compute to run just now. Sometimes we're like, well, as long as it runs within the next 48 hours, we're fine. And that's something that has been spearheaded by a group of us at the SSI. It was started as a hackathon idea, actually, and we kept working on that, which is this carbon-aware scheduler. And basically, it takes the 48 hours forecast of carbon intensity, and it says, well, the best window for your 4-hour job is, you know, tomorrow at 9 a.m. And then that's how to do it. So it's surprisingly hard to implement in practice, but the basic idea works well. I'm sure I don't need to explain the pros and cons of cloud computing. You know, you're all very familiar. You know, data centers tend to be efficient. You can choose the location. They're not very transparent with efficiency and with claims on net zero. So it's hard to know really how good the data center you are actually using is. And then it takes us to the issue of offsetting, which, I mean, if not done well and on a large scale doesn't really work. And I know we were talking earlier, there are lots of efforts here in Cambridge to make them work. But you know, there was this dreadful investigation into Vera, which is supposed to be one of the good guys. So that's one of these large carbon offsetting provider. They were supposed to do all the checking. So lots of companies looked at them. And when researchers and journalists looked at the carbon offsetting credits being sold, they found that over 90% of them had absolutely no value. So they either sold the same plot of forest multiple times, or something that wasn't supposed to be torn apart got torn apart. In terms of offsetting, I think my favorite example is from ICML last year, where they very proudly tweeted that it was in Hawaii. So, I don't know how many, several thousand people all flying from all over the world to Hawaii. But they explained that's okay. We are completely carbon neutral because we planted 36 trees. Which, well, it just doesn't add up. You can't make up for 7. That metric is also wrong at the bottom. I can't believe it's emitted 34 megaton of CO2. I really hope it's not. I think it's probably kiloton. That's what they mean, which is more in line. Even though I did a rough back of the envelope calculation using some of the metrics we use in the calculator, each tree needs to be there for something like 80,000 years for it to be true. And even if the number is 10 times less than that, even if it's 8,000 years, it's also completely unrealistic. So yeah, that's not a great example of, I don't really know what happened there, but yeah, not great. I'm just going to wrap up to a time for questions, but the last two of the greener principles are education and research, and that's the idea of implementing sustainability as a normal part of training people into computing. So we're doing that with some of the doctoral training program around Cambridge. We're doing that with the ABI, and that's really important. That just train research software engineers and researchers who are just mindful of these aspects. It doesn't have to be the whole topic, just something to be aware of. And we need to better understand power usage, because a lot of what we talked about, there are actually aspects we don't really understand about it. So we need to make our estimation tool better. This is just a ranking of carbon efficiency, energy efficiency of programming language. I'm not going to stop on it, but if I don't put the slide, then I always have a question about it. So I'm happy we can talk about it in a minute if you're interested in this particular aspect. And the last thing, and that's I promise this is the last thing, this is cultural change. And the reason is we can't solve a purely technological problem based on with technological solutions only, because we make a tool 10 times more energy efficient. The result is everyone using it 100 times more. It's great for research, it's great for innovation. It's not really good if the goal was to reduce energy usage in the first place. And that's why we need to both change how we think about computing and also rely on improvements. And so we try to build, and that's again coming up just at the moment, this sustainability community. And the idea is to have a place where anyone who is involved in scientific computing and interested about sustainability issue can kind of come up, ask questions, regular Zoom meetings, and so on. Not for people who work fully on sustainability, but for people for whom it's just a side interest and just want to be mindful. So if there's something that's of interest at all, you can. I know it's a lot of QR codes, but I'll send the slides afterwards. But yeah, you can scan that, and that can yeah, I'll put it back up again at the end anyway. And yeah, that's it. Everything I've talked about is on our website. I'll finish by thanking a million different people. There's been massive, a lot of people have been very involved in different aspects of this project. Any questions, very happy to take them, and you can email me afterwards. And yeah, I'll just leave it there for now. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? Michael.
I don't know how this. I'm assuming that you must have similar analogies. So I work a lot with ecologists. A lot of what you say, I find super interesting, and think perhaps will apply it. But a lot of the people who are become kind of unwitting computer scientists, the kind of ecologists who have become de facto data scientists these days.
Yeah.
That leap from I'm running this Python script, these two Python scripts, and one happens to have a high energy cost and one doesn't, is not, there's not an obvious link there. Have you seen any ways of kind of bridging that gap between having to have complete system knowledge to be able to make informed decisions here versus someone who just is using a computer to get on with another job?
No, and I mean, that's completely true. And that's why actually the slides I went a little bit quickly on, and I'll just share it again, is the importance. That was one of the recommendations of the UKI report, was to have more research software engineers. So part of the job is to say, I agree, you can't you can't expect scientists, and that's a weird thing. When you compare to wet lab research, they have lab technicians. They've accepted very early on that scientists are really bad at running experiments, and that's okay. Let's get people whose job is that. But for some reason, as you said, ecologists, biologists, suddenly they were expected to be both good at doing the code and doing efficient code and doing the science. What I found in bioinformatics, for example, is a big part is actually not going into the code, but just using the latest version of the software, or using efficient packages. So relying on the work that other people who know what they're doing have done. Because too often you would get bioinformaticians saying, well, sure, I could use the latest version. I heard it's a bit faster, but I don't really care. It's taking 2 days to run. I don't care. I do it on a Friday evening. I've got the result by Monday morning. Why bother updating? It's going to break all my pipelines. All the dependencies are going to break. Let's not do that. So just thinking about sustainability kind of includes this idea of using efficient code.
Have you actually spent any time studying how that sort of change, update, actually may cause, for example, experimental runs to have to be rerun many, many times because of those updates, when in fact, if you did leave it to run in the original, it would have cost you some factor. I'm not suggesting that it's the root rationale, but I think there is a balance there.
Totally. Oh yeah. And that's why we're not saying, sustainability should be the only focus on every software.
Well, even if you kept sustainability as your focus, the focus would suggest actually using the crappier software because it didn't involve, for example, just a simple example is a run that created bogus results because you didn't update an obscure library.
I mean, totally. The main challenge here is finding the balance between telling people it's okay in some cases to use the worst software, because as you said, if you think it's going to be rerunning the software. But also, if we say that to everyone, then there's no incentive to move to better software. And there are some situations where it would be. So the GWAS example was particularly striking. Updating from V1 to V2 of this GWAS software, you divide carbon footprint by 3. And that was going from 17 to 5 tons of CO2. So in this case, especially if they're doing it at scale, you're like, well, it's worth spending a bit of time doing the updates. So I think in the position we are today, where sustainability is not really a concern, I would say the first part is if you are only doing your small analysis once, I agree, it's not worth spending a lot of time thinking about how to make it more efficient, because if you're like, well, it's going to be 2 hours instead of 5 hours, but I'm only going to run it this one time, you're probably going to waste more time and more resources trying to test different pipelines. Now, if you're building a software that you're expecting the community to use, and in bioinformatics we've got loads of those, it's like a package, everyone is using it, it's using loads of compute, except it was built by a PhD student at the end of their PhD, and it's never been updated since. And that's for this piece of software where it's really worth investing research software engineer time to say, okay, well, you've done the work, now let's give it to someone who can do the optimization. But I mean, I completely agree. That's the point kind of about education, is to say, if you just make it part, if you just give the tools for people to understand the challenges and both sides of the equation, say efficiency is good, but not if it means spending a week to save 10 minutes. How can we, people can make a call then and just do the cost benefit for themselves.
But your point about potentially having an environmental impact statement alongside research ethics was really interesting, because the point of the ethics committees was to initially stop really bad lines being crossed, but then it progressed over the decades into changing the way that experimental design happened, right, in order to incorporate ethical frameworks into the practice of science and the scientific method. So I wonder with environmental statements if it's the wrong order. So really, environmental stuff is about opportunity cost, right? It's about saying that we will have to spend some energy, we'd rather spend it on something that minimizes our opportunity cost to the environment while maximizing benefits.
Yeah.
But the only way to really assess that is post hoc. So once the work's been done, and then you look back over everything that's happened, and you look back over the impacts, and then you figure out, well, this is actually the environmental kind of assignments for all the work you've done.
Yeah.
So maybe we should have a different framework for research environmental impact. So rather than having a pre-hoc statement, we encourage people to assess what happened.
I agree. I would be tempted to say probably both. It would be interesting to have both. The benefit of having it at the start. So, for example, taking the example of the what they did in France. So the call where they implemented it for the first time concluded in December last year. So they had the application through and they went through. And in terms of encouraging best practice, that's exactly what happened a little bit. So, for example, one application said they're proposing to do some kind of AI, and they said, well, we're not buying brand new GPUs because we don't actually need it. We're just going to repurpose some GPUs from another project. So the project just need to buy that off. That's something that would never happen in a branch because they were like, there were not big restrictions on budget, so they were like, oh, well, may as well ask for the money. You never know. But because here in this grant, they had an opportunity to highlight that as a benefit, and they knew that if they did that, it would increase their chance of actually getting the grant. It gives them a good reason to do it because basically it didn't impact their research at all. Like they had perfectly good GPUs, they would have bought the same ones, but it made no difference to the research. And so this kind of behavior incentives can be quite good. I completely agree. What we need is post hoc thing. The problem is if we start with the post hoc, if people haven't kept logs of anything they did over the whole project, then they will come to the end of it and they'll say, well, I have no idea what it was. So if you ask it at the start, and funders put in their policy to say, well, we ask it to do it in the project, and I agree, it's not going to be very accurate, it's going to be ballpark ideas. But keep in mind that in 5 years' time, when you have to report on the end of the grant, you're going to have to do the follow-up project. At least it's kind of in their mind from the get-go, and they can't say, oh, well, we didn't know. You're like, well, you did know. In terms of estimating, one thing I quite like is it has an inbuilt control mechanism, because really for a grant, if you want to, because it's always the question, how can you game the system? How are researchers going to find ways to go around there? But really here you can't really in a way, because you either say, well, my carbon footprint for computing is very low, but then that means you don't get the money to pay for compute hours on your servers, or you actually want to ask for all the compute hours you're going to need, but then you have to own up to it and put them in the calculator. So it has this kind of nice inbuilt mechanism that makes it a little bit. But I agree, ideally what we want is post hoc thing is, yeah.
But if you had some kind of iterative assessment and improvement, then that would cover that case of research software being abandoned, and you would show you'd have to improve it for the next time around as well. So.
No, totally, yeah.
Do you know why Cambridge hasn't signed up to that scheme yet?
No, well, so I think there was 17 initial signatories when there's been a work, the Concord that I've heard about it for years. It was like all in the background and it finally came out. Not a lot of universities did. So, it was 17, it was like a bunch of, UKI, Cancer Research UK, Wellcome Trust, a lot of that. And maybe 10 universities. So University College London, I think Imperial has signed up. So Oxford didn't sign up either. I think Edinburgh signed up. So, a few. It's not great of Cambridge not to. But there will be opportunities. So this Concordia will just keep growing. So institutions can join whenever. I don't know why they didn't. I wasn't made privy to the discussions.
Time for some more activism, I think. So
yeah.
Let's thank Lloyd for a